Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online message platform. We're so excited that you've decided to join us today. If you're new to Inland Hills Church, we are so excited that you are here with us today, and we want to get to know you a little bit more. So please take a moment to click the link below the video. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how we could be praying for you this week. If you call Inland Hills home, thank you for your continued partnership in giving with us today. You can continue to do so by visiting inlandhills.com/give. Now we are about to dive into an exciting message, and we just want to invite you to lean into the words that you are about to hear. It is our hopes that these words and this message uplifts you during the week ahead and just encourages you throughout whatever you are facing.
Hey, this is the second week of a new series that we're in called So This Is Christmas. And last week we looked a little bit at basically the entire Old Testament and the story leading up to the birth of Jesus. This week we're going to be in the book of Matthew and chapter number 1. So if you want to follow along in your Bibles, you're welcome to turn there right now. Matthew chapter 1. It's interesting, there's 4 different gospel accounts at the beginning of the New Testament that talk about the story of Jesus Christ. It's the gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. And 2 of those gospel accounts jump kind of right into the midlife of Jesus and tell us about really what he was like as an adult. 2 of them start before that. Luke tells us the entire Christmas narrative of his birth. And Matthew kind of starts even way before that. Matthew actually starts off his book, and it's the very first book of the New Testament. He starts off his book by telling of the lineage, the genealogy of Jesus. And so lots of people have decided like, oh, it's a new year, I'm going to read the whole New Testament through. And they get about 13 verses through Matthew 1, and they think, you know what, I'm not going to read the whole New Testament through. It's a rough way to start at the very beginning with a long lineage and genealogy, and it can just seem really, really dull and boring. But I want us to actually look at that today. You're welcome that we're going to look at the dull and boring part of the gospel story today, because if you dig into some of the names that are buried within that genealogy, you will find fascinating stories that I think tell us something important about Jesus and tell us something important about us. In fact, it's really, when we meet somebody for the very first time, we're trying to determine right away, like, who is this person and where is this person from? Like, that's usually a question that we start to ask. So we'll ask them questions like, hey, what do you do for a living? You know, that might be a question that we ask. Or we might ask someone like, where are you from? What town are you from? Or state or something like that. And we start to learn a little bit about them when we find out what they do for a living and where they come from, like lineage-wise or regionally, where they come from. That tells us something. And you can even find out about what someone's passionate about, what they've invested their time, resources, like studying or learning, when you find out what they do for a living. Or you can find out what someone is dispassionate about, depending on the enthusiasm with which they answer that question, right? So someone might say, I'm a school teacher, and I used to teach first grade, but now I teach third grade. I love third graders, and I've got this student named John this year who I've really had to pour a lot of energy into, but I'm starting to see him come around and really get plugged in, and it's really exciting to see. So that's one answer. Or you might hear from someone with less enthusiasm. Like, what do you do for a living? And they're like, I'm a contractor. My father was a contractor. My grandfather was a contractor. I do contractor things. Okay, so you may not love your job. Lots of contractors do, but you don't, and I get that. And there's teachers who also don't love their jobs. But with the enthusiasm with which that question gets answered tells you something about them. And then where are you from, right? That whole idea that you have some kind of parentage, lineage, or location that'll tell me something about who you are if I were to discover that. And we seem to inherently understand that who our parents were or who their parents were somehow molds and shapes us a little bit. Or if we didn't know them, that molds and shapes us as well. We even understand this in kind of modern folklore. I think our modern folklore are basically superhero stories. And so we have Superman, right? Who's a good-looking man, objectively. So we have Superman, played by Henry Cavill here in The Man of Steel. And Superman is born on the planet Krypton, right? His parents send him away as that planet's about to just explode. And he lands in a cornfield in Kansas. And these 2 people find him, Jonathan and Martha Kent, and they raise him as their own. So a son of Krypton becomes a son of the planet Earth. And if you know something about his heritage, you know something about what makes him the hero that he is. Or Batman. And I didn't practice with this TV before today or anything, but I didn't realize what a bad idea it was to stand this close to those eyes. That is just frightening. So Batman, his parents are killed when he's at an early age. And so he decides to spend the rest of his life trying to clean up the crime on the streets of Gotham City. So your parents passed away early on, and then you become Batman. Natural, obvious progression there. And then Spider-Man, right? Famously didn't really know his parents very well, but he's raised by his Uncle Ben and his Aunt May, and he's bitten by a radioactive spider, and he gains all these powers, but he doesn't know what to do with them. He's just trying to use them basically for profit. And then he had the chance to take out a criminal, but he decides not to. He had the chance to get that criminal arrested, and that criminal ended up killing his Uncle Ben. And so this is how Spider-Man learns the very difficult lesson that with great power comes great responsibility, right? So that's like you got to look back in his family lineage and you realize that that's how that happens. Or possibly the most dysfunctional family of all time, right? Luke Skywalker, whose father Anakin becomes Darth Vader. And if this is news to you and you didn't know that, you've had 30 plus years, okay? So sorry to spoil it for you, but get off your can and do something. All right, so this is the Star Wars story. And this matters a lot. Like, it's a huge turning point in that original trilogy when Luke finds out that Darth Vader is actually his father. He has this huge identity crisis, right? We seem to somehow understand that where we come from matters, shapes us somehow, molds us somehow. And even like, if you think about your own relationship with your parents or lack of relationship with your parents, you understand how that shaped you and molded you. Or if you think about, if you have kids and your relationship with your kids, you kind of are aware that the way that you interact with them will shape and mold them as well. My son Jack is 6. And a year ago, he was 5, math. So my wife was tucking him in about a year ago one night, and she read him a story, and she said something about having to go to work the next day. And he just asked a really simple question that a kid would ask. He said, Mom, why do you go to work? Like, what is that, right? What's the reason for that? And she said, well, my wife's a nurse. And she said, well, I really like my job, and I get to help people. But also, adults need to have jobs so that they can make money, and we use that money to buy things that we all need, things like food and clothing. And this house, she said, our money helps pay for this house, And then she said, like, if we didn't pay for this house, they would come and take our house from us, to a 5-year-old. And he said, they'll take our house from us? She said, no, they won't take our house from us. I'm just saying, like if we didn't pay them, the bank would want the house back. Like, so that's, sorry about that. I didn't mean to tell you that. And so he was like, she told him, it's fine. And she tucked him in, and she prayed with him, and she left his room, but he's like wide-eyed, like laying back. And she comes and tells me what she did, and I said, why did you say that? She said, I don't know. I was just talking off the top of my head, and we don't think anything of it. And then 2 or 3 months go by, and then she's tucking him in one night, and she's giving Jack just this big hug, and she says, oh, Jack, I could hug you like this forever. And Jack said, but if you did, they would come and take our house away. So you raise your kids, and you recognize that as you raise them, you are forming them and shaping them, and sometimes scarring them unintentionally. Like, all of that is true. But you find out where someone's from, and you find out something about them. I am the husband of Emily and the father of Jack and William, and I'm the son of Betty and David, and I'm the brother of Caleb. And that doesn't tell you much about me unless you know something about their story. If you find out that my father was an evangelist for over 40 years, and he traveled the country and continues to do that today. My mom once was a coach for inner city kids, and she's worked at clerking in law offices, and she's partnered with my dad in ministry for many years. If you find out about my wife is brilliant and kind and patient, and she's a wonderful nurse, but she was also salutatorian of her class, and I also graduated. And then and she's really musically talented, and she participated in like state competition vocally when she was in high school. Like, she's like, something about some of the people who I'm related to, and you can start to learn a little something about what may have molded or shaped me. So Matthew starts with a genealogy, because in the first century and still today, where someone comes from matters. It tells you something about them. You learn something of what's important in their life and why they are maybe the person who they are. But genealogies in the first century, especially written of really important people, were typically paid to do that by the person asking them to write. In fact, in the first century, most genealogies that were actually written out were written by people who received money from a kingdom, an empire, or a king in order to write the history of a kingdom, the history of an empire, the history of a king. And typically what they would do is for instance, if you're writing this out and you're being paid by someone to do it, you want to make the empire or the king look as good as you possibly can. And so if the empire had a defeat in battle, you would try to downplay that as much as possible. You may still note it, but you may act like it wasn't that big a deal. real. Or if the empire had a victory, well, you would try to inflate that as much as possible, right? Let's give as much weight to that victory as we possibly can. And we wouldn't want to embarrass them and talk badly about their kids. So maybe the king's son was killed in battle because he wasn't as good of a swordsman as someone he was going against. Well, we just either leave that part out, or we just say that he died trying to, secure the kingdom, or try to make his death even sound glorious. What you don't ever do in the first century when you're writing these genealogies out is to list embarrassing information. And yet, as we look through the genealogy and the lineage of Jesus Christ, we find lots of embarrassing information. It's almost like the author thought that this was real and true and it happened, and therefore we should just talk about it. What you also don't find in genealogies in the first century is really hardly any women listed in those genealogies. In the first century, women are thought of as little more than property, and they weren't even allowed to testify in a court of law because it was believed that their testimony was not trustworthy. And so women, thankfully through Christianity, we've made a huge cultural leap in the last 2,000 years, but for a long time, women were basically oppressed, held down, and the only worth that they had was that of childbearing in many places within the culture. And so you would leave them out of genealogies because that wouldn't help add credit to your genealogy. It wouldn't help to bolster it or to make it seem more authentic and more legitimate. And yet we find 4 different women in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and not all of them even Jews. And so I want us to pick up in the book of Matthew in chapter 1 and read what he writes. So this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, Abraham we talked about last week. He is the father of the Jewish people. He was the very beginning. Like in the very beginning, human beings walked away from God, but this Bible tells this wonderful love story of God trying to chase them down, essentially, and to restore that right relationship with him. And so God uses Abraham. He says, Abraham, I'm going to make a mighty nation out of you, and I'm going to bless you. But the reason you're going to be blessed is so that you can be a blessing to other people. And so Abraham has this mighty nation come out of him that ends up eventually giving birth to Jesus, the Messiah, the King. That's why we're starting there. So Abraham gets brought up at the very beginning. And Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram. Are you riveted so far? Here's what's fascinating. In the midst of what can seem like just a dull list of names, we have the name Tamar. You can find the story of Tamar in Genesis chapter 38. I'm not going to read it today because the story of Tamar is a bit too scandalous to read in church. I'm going to repeat that. There's a part of the Bible that's too scandalous for me to read in a Sunday morning gathering because it just wouldn't be helpful for numbers of people, especially those of us who brought some kids with us into the worship time today. So I'm going to tell you a more sanitized version of it when we clean up some of the other stuff, but it's still pretty bad. So Tamar married one of the sons of Judah, and that son died. And that son died before she was able to have children. And again, remember, the worth of a woman was largely in her ability to bear children at this point in time. So if you are a woman who is not able to have a child, your value to society has plummeted. And you feel like you're not even given human dignity by the people who are around you. Now, as was custom in that day, when this son died, when her husband died, the son of Judah, the next son in line was supposed to take Tamar as his wife, and so he did. But he refused to get her pregnant, and then he ended up dying, and then she had no one else to go to. And so her father-in-law, Judah, promised that when his younger son got to age, he would give Tamar to him, and that she would be able to have his children. But his younger son gets older, and that doesn't happen either. So here's a woman who's being held down by societal norms in a patriarchal society, and specifically by her father-in-law, and she's desperate to have value and worth, and so she figures the only way that she can have a child at this point is if she seduces her father-in-law. But he won't go for that if he knows who she is. And so one day he goes on a trip, and she dresses as a prostitute some ways down the road from him so that he will have to pass by her. And he passes by her but doesn't recognize her. She's got her face covered as prostitutes would have in those days. But it was obvious that she was showing her body. It was obvious that she was a prostitute. And so he propositions her, wants to have a sexual relationship with her. not realizing that it's Tamar. And so she says that she'll do that, but that's what a prostitute would do is ask for something in return. And there's a bartering system, not a cash system at this point. And so he promises to give her one of his young goats. And she says, okay, well, I'd like that goat then. And he says, well, I left my goat at home. And you know how it is. You leave home, you forget your goat behind. It's hard to buy anything these days. So he says, well, I don't have the goat with me. And he says, but I'll make you a promise. I'll leave you something as a stand-in so that when I you'll know that I'll bring the goat back. And so she asks for his seal, his cord, and his staff. These are valuable things, big identifiers of who he would be. And so he allows her to keep those things. They have a sexual encounter. She gets pregnant. He leaves, goes about his business, comes back to his own hometown. At that point, he sends a servant to go give the goat to this prostitute by the side of the road. But this servant can't find her, and he begins to ask around, and no one knows where she is. And he really wants to get the seal and cord and staff back, but there's no sign of her. In fact, the locals say, we don't have a prostitute in this area. We don't even know who you would be referring to. So upset and demoralized, this guy comes home and lets Judah know, like, I don't know where she is, can't find her. They don't know who she is. And so he says, okay, well, it is what it is. We can't do anything else. Months go by. And a servant runs to Judah and says, hey, we just discovered that Tamar is pregnant. Well, Tamar's not married. Tamar hasn't been given to this youngest son, so Tamar shouldn't be pregnant. Judah's outraged. How could this possibly happen? She must have been working as a prostitute. Have her burned alive. He wants her killed for this indiscretion. And so she gets a message to him before she's able to be killed. And a package, she sends a package, and it's his seal and his cord and his staff. And she says, the man whose baby is in my belly is the owner of these things. Do you know who that is? Her life is spared because Judah was presented with his own sin. And in the genealogy of the Savior of the world, we find Tamar, a woman who was held down by her culture, held down by her father-in-law. One of the most tragic stories in all of the Old Testament, because no one in it acts completely in good faith. Everyone makes some sad, terrible, tragic decisions. And we find her here in the genealogy of Jesus. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon, not Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. We come across Rahab in the Old Testament scriptures. She's not a Jew. In fact, Rahab has a nickname in the Old Testament. She's called Rahab the harlot. Rahab was a prostitute professionally. She worked within the city of Jericho. Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt after they've been enslaved for 400 years. And they go through the Red Sea and they go to Mount Sinai, and then eventually they arrive at the city of Jericho. And this is the land that God has promised he will give the Israelites. So Moses sends spies out into the land to go check and see, like, is this a winnable victory for us? And the spies come back, and 2 spies say it is, but the rest of them say that it isn't. And so the people don't have faith that they can take it. And so God ends up having them go and wander into the desert for 40 years. Moses finally dies. Power is handed over to Joshua, and Joshua leads the Israelites back to Jericho to take the city. But before he does that, he sends spies out into the land. Just sends 2 this time. Seemed to have learned the lesson from the last time that sending 12 out, too many. So he sends 2 spies out, and those spies go into the city of Jericho, and they would have been found out. But Rahab, who lives within the city walls, decides to hide these 2 spies. In fact, Rahab has heard the stories of Israel, has heard the stories of what God is doing in this nation and how God delivered them from Egypt. And she has decided for herself that this God, Yahweh, that the Israelites worship, must be the one true God. And so she agrees to hide these Israeli spies as long as they will remember her and keep her alive. She actually chooses to walk away and leave the life of prostitution she had known because she comes to decide that this God is the one true God. And you'll notice that by the time we get to Matthew, she's no longer called Rahab the harlot, but just Rahab. And within the genealogy of the Savior of the world, a former prostitute who was convinced that Yahweh was the one true God makes her appearance. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And finally, if you're a Jewish person in the first century and you're reading this, you're like, well, it was rough getting there, but at least we finally got to King David. This is the reason to put a genealogy together. This Jesus comes from the line of King David. King David is the most amazing king Israel has ever had. And if you're reading this in the first century, you are pining for the days of King David. When David was king, the Romans weren't overseeing us. The Babylonians and Assyrians hasn't conquered us. When David was king, everything was great. The whole kingdom was united. David was the greatest king we've ever known. And they believed that the Messiah, the one who would rescue them from their current troubles, would come from the line of David. But David had one huge, dark blot on his record. And it happened toward the end of his life. The huge blot on David's record was the fact that toward the end of his life, he saw a woman bathing from this palace as he was walking around on the roof there. And he wanted her. He longed for her. So he sent one of his servants to go get her and bring her back to the palace, and he laid with her, slept with her, and got her pregnant. This woman had a husband named Uriah who was off in battle where David should have been. He was fighting on behalf of his country, and while he was gone, the king took his wife, and let's not talk about it in any other way but this. He raped her. He used his power and his privilege and his might to have a woman come into his house and to sleep with her. He raped her. He sent her back home. She finds out she's pregnant. She lets him know. He decides to send for Uriah, to give Uriah, so that he'll come home and sleep with her so that they can cover it up and so that no one ever has to know. But Uriah refuses to go inside his house because he's too worried about his fellow countrymen who are still at war. So David sends Uriah back to the front lines, and he tells the general, put him in the front of the fighting where the fighting is fiercest because I want his life taken, basically. And Uriah ends up dying in battle. So David essentially kills a man, has a man killed in order to cover up the fact that he had raped his wife and impregnated her. And then David moves Bathsheba into his kingdom, becomes his wife. This is a huge dark stain on David. David, who was supposed to be a man after God's own heart. David, who the kingdom had rallied around. Like when Saul was still king and David had just defeated Goliath, they sang in the streets, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. From the very beginning, David seemed to be the anointed one who was going to change everything for Israel. And then toward the end of his life, he does this. And this ends up being having a domino effect on all kinds of things. His own son ends up trying to usurp his throne. He's actually successful for a time. David gets driven away from Jerusalem. He finally comes back and retakes it. But this terrible incident at the end of David's life ends up being a huge dark stain, and it just blots out so much else. By the time you get to the first century, the Israelites have tried to forget about that. Let's just remember the good times, right? Let's remember David when he was at his peak, because it was when our nation was at its peak. And so you finally get to King David here in Matthew 1, and the people aren't thinking about the bad thing David did when they first read this. They're thinking like, yes, David, our king, David, who really got us out of a lot of trouble. That's fantastic. But the author will not let them forget it. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Doesn't even use the name Bathsheba because the author seems to want to remind us that David's wife was once Uriah's wife. And it is because of the terrible thing that David did that he was able to marry her. And in the genealogy of the Savior of the world, a tale of rape and murder is embedded within it. It's shocking. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing we would find there. Who are you? Where are you from? Who are your parents? What is your family history? How has that molded and shaped you? Questions we end up asking explicitly or implicitly all the time. Last November, I was with a group of friends of mine. They're all pastors. We got to know each other through something called Leadership Network, and the 10 of us are pretty close. We try to see each other a couple times a year. We're from all over the country pastoring larger churches, and it's been such a great place to come and be honest with a group of guys of stuff that we're asking for prayer for, and just to hear about, give each other advice. And then we usually meet with an older pastor who's farther ahead of us and just get some wisdom from that person, and we download and we talk about our families, and they're a great group of friends. And so I was with this group last November, and one of my friends, I'm gonna call him Kevin. It's not his name, but I don't want to release identifying information, and none of you would know him, but we put this stuff online, and I don't know who's going to see what. So I've just changed his name and some details in order to keep him anonymous. But my friend Kevin tells all of us, like, he's got a bit of an update for us since we last spoke. Kevin's 41 years old, pastors a good-sized church, and he's an awesome guy. God's used him to do so many amazing things over the years. And so Kevin starts to tell us the story of what had happened to him just a few months before that summer. And so Kevin's got two brothers. His brothers are Michael and Zach, and then he's got a dad also. And here's what's crazy. Kevin's a pastor of a large church in North Carolina. Michael and Zach are pastors of churches in South Carolina, different churches. And then his dad is a pastor of a church in Georgia. Too many pastors at Thanksgiving is what I think. That's just too much in one room. But they're all pastors, which is so interesting. Well, last summer of 2018, Kevin found out that his father was having an affair on his mom. And he even had some text messages and some emails that showed this. And he contacted his brothers, Michael and Zach, and he's like, look, and Kevin's the oldest. Kevin said, look, I don't know what to do, guys. Like, I know Dad's having an affair. I feel like I have to talk to him about it. What should that look like? And they decided that the three of them would go together and just confront him about it. They felt like that was the most loving thing to do. It wasn't that they were just trying to do a gotcha or an aha. In fact, their hearts were crushed over this information. They just felt like their dad had to know how this was going to impact the family, and their dad had to know like how this is going to impact their mom, and he had to stop and repent of this. And so three of them got together and drove down to see their dad in Georgia and pulled up to his house. They had not told him that they were coming, no announcement at all. They knock on the door, he opens, and all three of his sons are there. And so he's confused, and he invites them in, asks them if they want anything to eat or drink. They said, no, Dad, we just got to talk. So they all sit down. And Kevin says, Dad, we found out that you've been having an affair on Mom for like the last couple of years. And his dad starts to deny it, so it's not true. He said, Dad, look, in my backpack, I've got physical copies that I've printed out of emails and text messages that show it. And I can pull that out, and we can read through those, and you can try to explain them away. Or, Dad, you can just be honest with us. We know this is happening. His dad broke down. Tears. So ashamed, so humiliated. They talked for a while. He apologized, gave his side of what happened that led up to this, but also owned that was no excuse and no reason for it. Kevin's brother Michael at one point in the conversation said, Dad, you can't keep telling us, like you can't keep secrets from us. You got to tell us the truth. This family can't have secrets anymore. Like, is there anything else that you haven't told us? And at that point, their dad looked at Kevin and said, Kevin, you need to know, I am not your biological father. What? I'm not your biological dad. What are you talking about? Like, you've been my dad my whole life. Like, I said, yeah. When your mom got pregnant with you, she was dating someone else, and they had a drug and alcohol addiction. Both of them did. The second she found out that she was pregnant with you, though, like, it changed her life. She did not want to bring you into that lifestyle, did not want to do damage to you in the womb, like, and she dumped her boyfriend at the time. They said, like, you can't be a part of this kid's life. Promise me you won't even contact this kid. I met her a few months after that, and we started to date a little bit, and we fell in love, and we decided to get married. And I just told her I would raise you as my own son, and I love you like my own son. But you're not my biological son. I said, well, who is? And as he's asking the question, even things started clicking for him in his mind. A lot of little things. Like, for instance, his dad's mom, his grandmother, he said, like, I started to remember that my grandmother had always treated Michael and Zach really, really well and had never treated me very well. And I just thought she didn't like me. I thought that there was something about me that she found unlikable or unlovable, and I just kind of tucked that away, but it had really hurt. And now I realize, oh, she knew. She knew that I wasn't her biological grandson, and that impacted the way that she treated me. And then he started to think about how he was treated at some different family reunions and how other people might have known, and just things started clicking that hadn't made sense before, but started to make sense at that point. So he asked him, like, well, do you know who my biological dad is? And he says, no, I know his name, but we haven't kept up with him. I don't know where he is. I don't know what he's doing. And so he gave Kevin the name, and it was a fairly memorable name. So Kevin went home and he started to do some internet research, Google and Facebook and Instagram, and within about 20 minutes, he had found his biological father. And his biological father, get this, was the pastor of care at a church in Florida at this point. What? Apparently a couple years after Kevin's mom dumped him, he stumbled into a church one day and heard about the life transformation story of Jesus, and he gave his life to Christ and changed everything about him. And he went to college and he got a master's degree in psychology, and he worked in therapy for a while until eventually working himself into a church position where he did pastoral counseling and psychology. So Kevin reached out to him on Facebook, and they ended up having a phone call together, and he's like, this is insane to me. This is crazy to me. He said, like, did you know where I was? And Kevin's biological dad said, oh, yeah, I've internet stalked you for quite a while now. I promised your mom I would never reach out to you, and I wanted to keep that promise. I'm really proud of you. And so he invited him to come down to Florida, and so Kevin brought his wife and his kids, and they all went down to Florida to hang out with his biological dad, and they went into a worship service at his dad's church that day, and he's standing next to his father, and his wife and his kids next to him. This is just so surreal, and no one else in the church knows that this is happening. Hasn't even shared it with the staff or the worship team, and the second song they did that day was Good, Good Father. And Kevin said, I mean, I liked that song before, but like, this just felt crazy. So he told us all this story that afternoon, and then we had a few sessions together, and we had dinner together, and then we all kind of called it a day. And that night, I got to bunk in the same room as Kevin, and I talked to him for 3 or 4 more hours about it, because I just wanted to understand what he was going through. I just said, man, what has this done for your morale, or what has this done for your even self-conception? And he said, man, to be honest with you, I really thought that I was firm in my identity. I really did. But then to find this out at the age of 41, that the person I thought was my dad my whole life has been a dad to me, but is not my biological father. Like, it was earth-shaking. It was earth-shaking. It's like I felt like I didn't know myself at all. I'm at this point in my life. I've got a family of my own, and I felt like I didn't know myself at all. I said, so what has that felt like? What has that been like? He said, Josh, I never thought that I really defined myself by my family of origin all that much, but it turns out that I did. And what I've learned through all this is, check this out. What I've learned through all this is that every single day I have to wake up and remind myself that first and foremost, I am a child of God. And I have to get my identity out of my relationship with Jesus Christ and not out of any other lineage that I have. That's what I'm discovering. In John chapter 1, we read this. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. And everyone who hears this message, and everyone who chooses to place their faith in Jesus has the opportunity to become a child of God. So who am I? I'm Josh Crain. I'm the husband of Emily, and I'm the father of Jack and William. I'm the son of Betty and David and the brother of Caleb. Who am I? I'm the guy that actually came to faith as a fairly young child and found something valuable about Jesus in a childhood-like faith. Who am I? I'm the guy who a few years later actually felt that faith start to fall apart and disintegrate as I started asking adult questions of a childhood faith that frankly just wasn't strong enough to withstand the weight of those questions. Who am I? I'm the guy who wrestled with that for several years in my early 20s and eventually found something so remarkable about Jesus that I had to come back to him and to see myself finally as being adopted into that family family. Who am I? I am the guy who found that I have issues in my own life that need to be dealt with. I'm the guy who struggled with pride and the guy who struggled with control issues. And I'm also the guy who struggled with pornography in my early to mid 20s, that struggled with all of those things. Who am I? I am the guy who determined at some point that next to the yardstick of God's holiness and righteousness, there's no way I would never measure up. But who am I? I am the guy that came to terms with that because I started to recognize that first and foremost, at the bottom of everything, I am a child of God. Who am I? I am who he says I am forever and ever. Amen. That's who I am. And that's who you can be too. That's the invitation that's extended to all of us this Christmas season, to put our faith and hope in Jesus Christ and to see ourselves as part of the ongoing story of this crazy lineage of Jesus. Matthew tells us the Christmas story, and Matthew says this story has a shape to it. Matthew seems to suggest that all of us who put our faith in Jesus Christ continue that lineage on. Matthew says that this story is God's story, but Matthew says that God's story is our story. And if this is our story, then Abraham is our father, and Tamar is our mother, and King David, messed up King David, is our king. This is a story with many roots, a closet full of skeletons, a story of incest and lust and pride. This is not a genealogy of purity or pride. It's a genealogy of grace. You see, what Matthew seems to want us to understand at Christmas time is that Jesus didn't just come for sinners. He came from sinners. And there's something about the miraculous message of Jesus, that he came into this world through a broken lineage, that reminds us that even though we are broken, and even though we have something in our past that's probably embarrassing to us, or failed relationships, or maybe we never knew our parents, or maybe we had a terrible relationship with them, or maybe we're struggling to have a good one with our own kids, or maybe we feel lost or rudderless in this world, wherever we are invited to become children of God. That's the story of this season. Merry Christmas. Father, thank you for our time together today. And Lord, thank you that you didn't whitewash the story of the lineage of Jesus, God who's fully human, but also fully God. And sometimes we're more comfortable scrubbing the human part away and pretending that it's not there because we just want to focus on the God part of Jesus. But Lord, he's 100% in both. And so thank you that we get to see the mess of a story that he's born into and how God uses his birth and his life and his teachings and his death and his resurrection to extend to us the invitation to become your children. And God, I pray this Christmas season that we will see ourselves anew as we see ourselves through your eyes and through the story of Christmas. It's in Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen.
Thank you so much for watching this message. It is our hopes that it encourages you and uplifts you in the week ahead. We also invite you to join us at one of our Sunday services here at 9, 11, or 5 p.m. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you here soon.